Good morning, everybody. My name is Emmanuel Bonejayi. I'm a professor here at the University of Victoria, and I'm the lead for 21st Century Borders and the Borders and Globalization Lab. Today, I acknowledge with respect the Langkwangran people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Versanes people whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. And with this, I would like to say that I've lived in this beautiful land for more than 25 years now, and that I love it, and I feel very grateful every day to be a settler on a unceded territory of the Langkwangran-speaking people. It's my delight today to have Simon Dalby kick off the so-called Big Lab webinar series. This webinar series is recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Big Borders and Globalization Lab YouTube channel that you can see and find on the bigglobalization.org websites. We will feature colleagues in the network who have new publications 4 times a year, and this with Simon Dalby, who doesn't really need an introduction. We're basically kicking off this with his new book on firepower, geopolitics, and the future: rethinking environmental security. Simon Dalby is a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. He is a fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation and a senior research fellow at the University of Victoria Center for Global Studies. He's one of our senior fellow here in the center this year. We're delighted to have him. And I cannot go through the list of his publications because he is highly productive. He's publishing probably a book every year plus a number of articles. So I'm not going to go through this. He's internationally respected for his work in geopolitics. And his most recent publication have won international awards. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Simon. And so today the talk is Firepower, Geopolitics, and the Future: Rethinking Environmental Security. And Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Okay, there we go. Firepower, Geopolitics, and the Future. The most recent book I've written is called Rethinking Environmental Security. And really the themes that I address in it are firepower, geopolitics, and the future. And so this talk is an attempt to put all of these pieces together. The background is indeed flames and fire, because what I want to tease out in the next hour in my presentation is the crucial, important point about about fire, because combustion has been absolutely crucial to powering modernity. It has also been crucial to the warring and the struggle for territory. That's the geopolitics theme as well. And reflecting on 50 years out from the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, which launched the United Nations Environment Programme, and that was 50 years ago. It's time to do some rethinking, go back and look at the themes that were first raised in Stockholm, and then think about, well, what's changed? How do we now understand these notions in light of 50 years since the first tentative efforts of the United Nations Environment Programme? Yes, there's some Canadian content here because, of course, Maurice Strong was the chair of that original conference in Stockholm in 1972. So next slide, please, Stephanie. This is an iconic image as of last week. Yes, Port au Basque, the storm surge from that huge hurricane, leaving this house precariously balanced on the edge of the seashore as the waves undercut its foundations. This one went viral. This was the other eastern shore of Canada last week. And it raises, pun intended, all sorts of questions, because sea level rise and storm surges are part and parcel of the climate change hazards that we are dealing with. this environment is very obviously not secure, although sitting up on the rocks until very recently, the residents of the shoreline in Port aux Basques could rest assured that they were out of harm's reach. Not anymore. And I think that this is one of the things that has been shifting people's attention to these issues. Next, please, Stephanie. This is, of course, slightly more recent photograph. This is Hurricane Ian in Florida a few days ago. And the mobile homes and small houses literally pushed off their foundations. Again, this is rising sea levels. Storm surges are, of course, getting more severe as the hurricanes get bigger. The extremely rapid intensification of storms is, of course, one of the issues that we've all been hearing about from the meteorologists. One of the things that's extraordinary about this photograph from Florida, however, is if you look carefully at most of those mobile homes and indeed many of the other homes, in many cases, actually, the roofs have stayed on. So clearly these were moved by the storm surge, but the wind has not removed the roofs. I'm not sure how many of those houses are built since 1992, when the new building codes actually came into force in at least parts of Florida. But one of the things that, of course, is that we will need to pay attention to is we are actually learning to deal with some of these things. And hurricane ties and simple structural adjustments can make a considerable difference to the survival of buildings. It doesn't help with storm surges, but in terms of winds and building to deal with these issues, as in Google Babcock Ranch, the CNN report on the solar power community that survived more or less a direct hit from the hurricane. All of these are issues that we need to now deal with. Can we survive? Can we deal with enhanced storms and the damage? Well, up to a point we can, but we need to rethink many of these things. Next, please. Because we are seeing freakish weather. This was earlier this year. What on earth are we doing getting heat in Antarctica that is so far off the charts? Clearly, we're getting bizarre anomalies. We are beginning to live in a world that is climate changed in all sorts of odd ways. Storm surges, temperature that is simply, quite literally here, off the charts. And this was earlier this year. One of the things that, of course, everybody's increasingly alarmed about is the ice sheets in Antarctica. And when you're getting bizarre heat anomalies like this, there's good reason to worry. Next, please. We are also, of course, living in a world where it isn't just about fire and floods. We're also dealing with the COVID pandemic, and we're beginning to understand the interconnections between some of these things. It isn't just floods, it isn't just fire, it isn't just drought. And here in British Columbia, at least down on the coast, we've had an incredibly dry summer. I'm sitting in a place that's on stage 4 droughts, which is beginning to cause all sorts of environmental concerns for wildlife, for plants. Clearly, the local deer are getting very hungry in some places too. The point about this is that we are dealing with multiple insecurities simultaneously. And the irony of the wildfires in Australia a couple of years ago, about to burn down the sign that was telling people to be careful in terms of the disease outside a senior centre in Australia, captures, I think, the multiple hazards that any notion of environmental security now has to begin to grapple with. Next, please. We are dealing with drought, we are dealing with flood, we are dealing with fire. And if you will forgive the dreadful pun, we have to make sure that we don't go into a funk dealing with it. Chris Funk's book is trying to suggest that we have these multiple catastrophes supercharged, as it were, by climate change. And we need to consider all of these as part and parcel of what environmental security now has to grapple with. Next, please. One could argue that this whole debate, the whole idea of environmental security really can be traced back to 1972 and the first United Nations Conference on the human environment, as it very aptly called it back in 1972 in Stockholm. The logo is on your screen, a logo that has, at least in my life, been significant because I remember as a much younger person paying attention to some of these issues back in 1972 when I was in school, sort of pondering what my future might be, pondering how on earth we studied and thought about all of these things, because clearly that was on the agenda in a small way back in 1972. Next, please. What really caught my attention going back and looking at the declaration that came from the conference recently is the very last of the principles in the conference declaration. Man and his environment must be spared the effects of nuclear weapons and all other means of mass destruction. States must strive to reach prompt agreement in the relevant international organs on the elimination and complete destruction of such weapons. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, this is geopolitics. It's not just nature and environmental protection, parks, people preservation, those things. There was actually another agenda at Stockholm back in 1972, and quite a lot of people were very concerned about nuclear weapons. And then I realized, actually, wait a minute, yes, of course, we were dealing with the extraordinary expansion of the superpower nuclear arsenals. We were also dealing with superpowers sparring over the conference. Western states didn't want East Germany to get delegate status. The East Bloc stayed away from the conference in protest because East Germany wasn't going to get delegate status to the conference. But on the backdrop of all of this was also the superpower rivalries and increasing concern about the sheer size of the nuclear capable weapon systems. And of course, here's the firepower connection, because yes, technically nuclear detonations aren't combustion, but much of the destruction caused by nuclear weapons, should they be used, is of course secondary fires. So the burning of cities, the burning of anything that was close to the ignition point of a nuclear weapon is of course the secondary damage that is the weapons are designed to cause. So there's a clear connection here between the military dimensions of firepower, the ability to destroy things using various modes of combustion, and environmental issues in other ways. Because, of course, climate change is all about combustion, a theme to which I will return in many ways in coming few minutes. So this is what made me think, wait a minute, this actually is the connection between international security and weapons and environmental stuff that clearly the people at the conference were concerned about. Next, please. Because one of the most extraordinary documents from the 1970s has to be Barbara Ward and René Dubos's informal background report for the conference. Yes, that's a NASA photograph on the front. And it was, of course, also the time when NASA suddenly started going to the moon and taking all these extraordinary pictures of planet Earth from a distance. And the sense that there is only one planet, the small blue marble against the backdrop of deep black empty space, was an iconic image of the time, which did change quite a few people's consciousness of these things. And it was this as a background report to the conference that is worth noting. For me, of course, the connection with climate change, the connection with our current dilemma. There's an incredibly poignant passage in the middle of Only One Earth. Remember, this was published just in advance of the 1972 conference. There's an extraordinary poignant line in there about if cars continue to expand in terms of the numbers around the planet in the way they had done through the 50s and 60s, then the prospect of an indescribably hot planet looms. So even back in 1972, it was very clear that this kind of internal combustion engine-driven civilization had a major danger of causing global heating. And it's worth bearing in mind that this, in that sense, isn't new. The warnings were there right back in 1972. Next, please. The other angle on geopolitics, which really matters in terms of the legacy of 1972, is that the only government leader, apart from the Swedish Prime Minister who was there, was Indira Gandhi. And her speech, in which she basically, she's immortalized in terms of, and I paraphrase, in terms of saying that, you know, poverty was the worst pollution. But it's more important that she actually raises the crucial question of if few northerners who have done development and have wrecked the planet in the process think that you are going to use it as an excuse to deny us the prosperity that comes from getting ourselves developed along the trajectories that you've done. Well, forget it, because we are entitled to development, and you're not going to use environmental restrictions to stop our getting our populations out of poverty. The north-south dimension in terms of geopolitics was very present in Indira Gandhi's extraordinary speech, well worth going back and reading. And it's all over the internet. If you actually Google it, there's various versions of it that are easy to find. But again, that set the other dimension of geopolitics firmly in the agenda. It is worth pointing out that, of course, environmental security, the term itself, was never actually used in Stockholm. It's a subsequent development. Next, please, Stephanie. It emerges from the attempt 15 years later in the Brundtland Commission to actually solve the dilemma that Indira Gandhi had posed in Stockholm. Because we need development, but we also need environment. So the Commission on Environment and Development, how do you link these things? And of course, sustainable development becomes the crucial rhetorical phrasing in which the difficulties of juxtaposing environment and development are at least rhetorically resolved. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs is, of course, the classic definition of what sustainable development needs to do. We need to be absolutely clear that this is going to have to be dealt with. And so we move ahead with the discussion. What is also in here, and usually forgotten, is, of course, that sustainable development is actually seen as the answer to environmental insecurity. And so we have a situation where it is that we need to respond to environmental insecurity by sustainable development. The issue is, of course, that we have a long-standing discussion about environment, starting in Stockholm, moving through the debate in Our Common Future, and it's specifically the resolution to environmental insecurity that then gives rise, next please, that then gives rise to the huge debate about conflict and environment. And this is, of course, one of Thomas Homer Dixon's basic schemes in terms of how we deal with understanding the possible relationships between environmental scarcity highlighted in Brundtland and the difficulties that might result. Because, of course, the whole environmental security discussion after the late 80s was suggesting that after the resolution of the Cold War geopolitical standoff, we might well end up with a whole series of environmental issues causing major security problems. And indeed, the issue here is it in fact the case that we get obvious conflict from environmental degradation? And this was an attempt to think it through in the 90s, because the basic assumption in environmental scarcities as a source of conflict, Thomas Homer Dixon was basically saying, well, wait a minute, do we actually know this? Do we have empirical studies which suggest this? And basically, this complicated diagram suggests that there may be links, but they're not at all easy to suggest that, in fact, environmental scarcity causes conflict. And indeed, much of the debate in the 90s was precisely about the social science methods relating to this. Many of the headlines simply assumed that if you get environmental problems, it will lead to conflict. The subsequent social science, and this has suggested that this is much, much more complicated. But in terms of the 90s, clearly this was how the whole environmental security discussion worked its way through. Not much about firepower in here until you get to the end, when conflict, of course, involves the use of weapons and so on. Next, please. The attempts to deal with this in terms of policy were, of course, in June of 1992, 20 years after the Stockholm Conference. Following up on those themes, in the Brundtland report, although there's somewhere, and I can't find it, I remember seeing a little clip of Gro Harlem Brundtland actually addressing the conference and her using the term environmental security, and the audience simply not effectively responding to the use of the term. Because although the term environmental insecurity runs all through her report, sustainable development was seen as the answer, not a specific policy of environmental security as a framework. Nonetheless, it runs right through this whole discussion. What is clear is that this is the launch of both the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Biodiversity Convention as well, the two major conventions that were open for signature, basically have their origin in this conference. And of course, the two really big questions we are now dealing with 30 years later is both climate change and the extinction crisis. And so there's a clear line here between the concerns in these reports, the policy initiatives which have yet to grapple effectively with our circumstances. And again, yes, there's Maurice Strong's in there somewhere. I don't think he's actually in that photograph, but again, there's a little bit of Canadian content on all of this too. Next, please. You've all seen this diagram. At least it's an iconic graph of our times. And it is worth noting where the parts per million of carbon dioxide were in 1972, just over 320, 324, 5, something like that. They were 350 when the World Commission report, the Brundtland report, was actually published in 1987. They were a few points higher in 1992. And despite the Framework Convention, despite the understanding that climate change was one of the things that needed to be addressed, that graph has inexorably gone up simply because of the huge amount of fossil fuel consumption since. We are literally using combustion, fire to power our economies, power our vehicles, heat our homes, and so on. And this, of course, is leading inexorably to the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it is well worth stopping and thinking on what the parts per million was when you appeared on this planet. I actually showed up a week or two before they started measuring it at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. This is the graph of my times. I'm not entirely responsible for all of it, but it is worth stopping and thinking about your parts per million number just to connect yourself to these global changes in a very intimate, personal way. Next. Because those extraordinary changes in terms of the rapidly accumulating carbon dioxide and a whole lot of other things suggests that we have created something called the Anthropocene. Our fingerprints are all over how the Earth system now functions. We do not live in a planet where the climate is shaped any longer by celestial mechanics, the orbit of the Earth, the tilt of its axis, the so-called Milankovitch cycles. For many hundreds of thousands of years was the driving force in terms of what the climate of the planet actually was. No longer. Now the dominant force that is determining the future of the planet is human activity, or at least the activity of the rich and industrial carbon-fueled using part of humanity. And it is crucially important that we name this era in some appropriate term. Anthropocene, in terms of Earth systems, geological history, is a new era in which the dominant forcing mechanism of the climate is carboniferous capitalism, to use Lewis Mumford's marvelous phrase. And it is clearly the point that we need to grapple with. We do live in new times. We do not live in the planet that our forebears lived in insofar as what is now driving the most basic climate of mechanisms is industrial and heating and so on, all those other things that fossil fuels do for us. They are the power that has given us the ability to change the planet. And in that sense, firepower, literally the power that getting hold of, controlling, and using fire has given us, is the mechanism driving the Anthropocene. And we need to make those connections very explicitly. Next, sorry. We need to break some of our boundaries. We need to also understand that we can now get the message out in a Netflix documentary. Actually, the book is well worth reading, but it's also very interesting to look at the marketing on this, because the foreword from Greta Thunberg gets higher profile billing on the front cover than the authors' names. This science of our planet, understanding in plain English how it is that we have changed so much of the Earth system in the last while, is absolutely crucial to rethinking environmental security, because no longer can we try to protect a given context. We now have to think about how we are making that future, quite literally by how our policies, our lifestyles, and particularly the energy mix going forward will change how the Earth system is working. Next, please. Partial recognition in this nicely fuzzy photograph. Yes, it's an awful photograph. You should never put a slide like this in a talk, but it's actually the slide I could find that had the most women on the main stage at the crucial moment, because of course it does usually look as though my demographic, the stale pale males, dominate all of these things. And it is worth pointing out that there were some crucial women driving the Paris process too. And this is one photograph that actually does give some credit to the gender dimension of these international negotiations. 2015, 7 years ago, Paris was the first attempt to really implement an agreement that was likely to be comprehensive. Yes, we had Kyoto back quite a ways back, which Canada notably left, and a couple of other countries were not very keen on it either. This was an attempt at comprehensive grapple with it. But as my students said at the time, but Professor Dalby, it doesn't mention fossil fuels. This is gonna... Yes, it didn't. But trying to actually get the Framework Convention acted upon and recognize the geopolitics of the world that we live in which states are insisting on their prerogatives to provide the solutions to a communal problem, is something that we really do need to also pay a whole lot of attention to, because it was obvious that actually getting everybody to admit there was a problem and getting everybody to admit to some mechanisms that would actually begin to address it was actually a considerable diplomatic accomplishment on the part of the French in particular. And we need to mark that. But we also need to recognize that it was not likely in and of itself to deal with the implications of our new understanding of ourselves in the Anthropocene. If you can skip forward, Stephanie. One more, please. Because this is really what most of the discussion around Paris was suggesting. We needed to rapidly change the trajectory in terms of the use of fossil fuels. The amount of fire, the amount of combustion in our system needed to be drastically reduced to cut the amount of carbon dioxide in particular being generated. This is the pathways to either 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, which requires a fairly dramatic change in terms of how it is we use fossil fuels. We have to reduce the amount of firepower in the sense of the fires that power our society, need to do so quite dramatically. It is also worth pointing out, of course, that we also need to reduce the amount of firepower in terms of weapon systems, because the potential for nuclear dangers in terms of the use of weapons is much discussed in the headlines once again now, 50 years after Stockholm, and the whole discussion about what Putin might or might not use in the Ukraine, or for that matter elsewhere, reminds us of the immense environmental damage that would also result from the use of nuclear, in addition to the human casualties. We are paying attention to this, and in Canada, this is last week or the week before, the latest report from the Canadian Climate Institute, which is making clear that we can act in various ways to adapt to the changing climate, but it also makes quite clear that if we don't get dramatic reductions in emissions, all the adaptation efforts aren't going to make a huge difference. We do need to do both. Clearly, we need to talk to people that live on beaches, whether it's in Porto Basque or elsewhere in Canada, about the dangers of storm surge. Evacuation planning in the Maritimes is going to need an upgrade, clearly, after the lessons learned from that episode last month. But we also need to realize that there are all sorts of other things that need to be done in terms of planning, in terms of how we build buildings, and how we make sure that we get our land use planning right, so that flood events, which are likely to happen, are minimized. We minimize them. Next, please. The findings, the executive summary of this is crucial. Emissions reductions and proactive adaptation measures taken together are the most effective means of reducing cost. Dig into that in a little more detail, and it's quite clear that we simply have to reduce the costs of climate change, the damage done, not least because of the opportunity cost. If you're spending money repairing stuff, you're not spending it doing other useful things. And there really is, in that sense, all sorts of economic implications for failing to be serious about adaptation. I have still a Laurier prof, but when I had a house back in Waterloo that needed a roof a few years ago, I was delighted that the contractor said, well, Simon, we are not going to put a roof on your house unless we can do it to resist a Category 3 hurricane force winds. And I signed up with that contractor because clearly they were thinking seriously about how to do this job in a way that would deal with potential future storms and the difficulties that are likely to arise. So it is beginning to make impacts through many sectors of our society. Trying to get hold of a heat pump these days is a little more difficult because so many other people in so many other places in the world want them too. We are beginning to respond. We are beginning to think about the very practical, personal applications of adaptation measures in addition to the larger policy debates, and that's all encouraging. Next, please. We are starting to think about disasters and the response, but as the folks in this report, and again, I try to put reports on my slideshows that have catchy titles that are easy for people watching to actually Google. We'll see that we have other things to think about too. Next, please. The crucial point is that we are dealing with extreme weather events, but we also need to think about slow onset events, i.e. the droughts, i.e. sea level rise is, of course, crucial. If the sea level is rising about 3 millimeters a year, it may sound trivial, but it's been doing so for quite a long time. The suggestion is we're already about a foot higher than the 19th century. So clearly the Earth system is responding. And if you're dealing with a port that was designed in 1920 with docks and things, well, the difficulties of high tides overtopping all sorts of facilities in ports is something that we need to deal with. Ironically, one of the places where this is most obvious these days is in the huge naval base on the Atlantic coast in Norfolk Broads in Virginia in the United States, where they're regularly having situations where their buildings on land and their docks are getting overtopped. Chatting with some folks in NATO last year, that was one of the things they were dealing with that day. I was trying to convince them that they should ride bicycles because you can bring a bicycle into the building and not worry about your car getting flooded in the parking lot. Don't think that went down very well, but it's an adaptation measure that we should all be considering. What is also really worrisome, of course, is the tipping points where there may be non-linear responses in such things as the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet, the collapse of the so-called Gulf Stream, or for that matter, the Amazon rainforest issue, which is much in the headlines again, of course, with the ongoing presidential election in Brazil on our minds in terms of that one at the moment. The crucial point here, of course, is that we may get surprises. We may get rapid sea level rise, and our port planners, sewage facility planners on the coast thinking seriously about what happens if they suddenly get 3 or 4 or 5 feet higher sea levels. BC ferries will have some thinking to do too. The point about this is that we need to be thinking about how it is we plan for these rapid changes and stop and think about what on earth does this mean in different parts of the world. Next. In terms of borders, in terms of globalization, in terms of the existing state system, of course, everybody thinks about Tuvalu because literally the Pacific atolls are getting inundated. What do we do in terms of states that no longer are above sea level? What do we do with our peoples? What do we do with notions of sovereignty? What do we do about citizenship, rights, migration? All of those things are immediately being thought about in terms of the implications for a new world. This too, of course, is a matter in terms of geopolitics, in terms of literally the map, the struggles for territory, the struggles to decide who gets sovereignty over what are simply unavoidably raised. Tuvalu being the sort of the poster child for this issue. And you may notice that that's not a new debate because that cartoon is an older one, but it still makes the point very, very clearly, I think, in terms of how it is that we think about borders, how we think about the future in terms of where crucial populations may actually reside. Next, please. Because, of course, there are areas where there are very much larger populations than the Pacific atolls. And, of course, 3 or 4 feet of sea level rise doesn't get evenly distributed around the world, but nonetheless, Bangladesh is particularly vulnerable to these things. If you have half your population living less than 5 meters above sea level, you've got yourself a huge vulnerability. And there are hundreds of millions, a couple of 100 million people in Bangladesh. Where do they go? How do they move? What implications does that have for international politics? Nobody even wants to think about what happens to the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. There's all of these big questions that we need to deal with as a global community. And it makes the point that, of course, what environmental security means varies widely around the world. If you're a low-lying deltaic state, which is effectively much of Bangladesh is, then it has a very different set of concerns than the interior of British Columbia, where we may be more worried about fires and floods than we are about sea level rise. But we do need to note that adaptation is local, and that needs us to engage with the finer points of jurisdiction, boundaries, and the responsibilities of which agency to do what in particular circumstances. So adaptation and looking at these scenarios is very much a local issue, but the global accretion of carbon dioxide is, well, just that, global. Because one bit of carbon dioxide will get us into trouble, the same as the next bit. But remembering Indira Gandhi, of course, the whole notion that our luxury consumption should be equated with survival agricultural activities in the global south is equating two very different things. And this, of course, too, is the geopolitics insofar as a bit of methane or a bit of carbon dioxide coming out of a rice paddy in South Asia is significant very different ways than our luxury SUVs in North America. A point that the protesters that are going by the delightful title these days of tire extinguishers are trying to make in terms of focusing on the implications of luxury consumption in the face of a climate emergency. Next, Stephanie. Does it set huge numbers in motion? And if so, what kind of bordering practices? How does state sovereignty address the need for numerous people to seek safety? And this dramatic picture of a slightly overcrowded vessel, I hope, makes the point in terms of the necessity of grappling with notions of the essential requirement to move out of harm's way, which is the most basic climate adaptation of all. And it seems to me that this is one of the issues that we need to address. Relatively speaking, the numbers despite the headlines from the Mediterranean and other parts of the world, think of Australia and boat people there. Nonetheless, this raises the bigger question about adaptation, because mobility is a basic adaptation measure, and we live in a world, next Stephanie, which is often demarcated in terms of exclusive territories. And this is, of course, Arizona with a fence that actually pre-existed Donald Trump's fascination with walls, designed to ride up and down on the sand dunes, preventing 2- and 4-legged creatures from crossing, but allowing the landscape to change nonetheless. Surely an extraordinary symbol of our age, which suggests that we have some thinking to do, because if the landscape can adapt to changing conditions, but the populations living on them can't, we have got a disjuncture here that goes to the heart of making numerous peoples environmentally insecure, precisely because the basic adaptation measure of movement to move to more conducive climes is prevented by this exclusive jurisdiction trying to prevent people from moving. So we have a major dilemma facing us in terms of geopolitics there. How it is sovereign states respond to a dynamic world is something that we need to do a whole lot more serious thinking about in coming years. Next slide. As a scholar, of course, one is required to invoke impeccable authorities on crucial themes, and who better than our friend to get us to focus on how security actually works. Because fear of others, fear of migrants is, of course, one of the real dangers here. And that, of course, brings me back to the irony of the land acknowledgement that Emmanuel started our presentation with. Because, of course, most of us in Victoria, in British Columbia, in North America, are settlers. We are invaders. We are migrants. And we need to stop and think seriously about the implications of what we are saying if we are building fences to keep other people out, having actually invaded the native people's territories in North America in particular, and in numerous other parts of the world where European colonists changed the geopolitics of the world dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries. And understanding that invoking fear and security in that sense may lead to hate, suffering, and anger. I think those fences across in the previous image make us stop and think about who's securing what, how, and this very, very particular geography about mobility is something we really do need to grapple with. And of course, that is absolutely at the heart of the whole land acknowledgement point. Moving on. Please, could you prepare a place for my country to stay? It's a simple request, but it is something that we need to stop and think much more carefully about. Who migrates where? Because let's be very clear about it. Climate change is caused by us, not them. The rich, developed part of the world is the one that has used fossil fuels historically much more than the colonized parts of the world. It is clearly our responsibility as the users of firepower to stop and think about this much more carefully. And of course, the whole refusal on the part of the North, in the North, well, at least the G7, to think about their responsibilities in terms of loss and damage and to fund climate adaptation. This is one of the crucial sticking points on this. Because while the earlier diagrams I showed you of Thomas Homer Dixon may be focused on insecurities and conflict in the global south as an issue, it is worth emphasizing that environmental scarcities in the south are not what is now causing environmental insecurity. It's the climate change impacts of the abundance of fossil fuels, not the scarcity of other environmental resources, that is the fundamental driving factor in current understandings of environmental security. We have spread vehicles rapidly, and the indescribably hot planet that Barbara Ward warned us of back in 1972 is coming to fruition. Dan Smith's line, the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is we are now living in the world that the folks in 1972 hoped to avoid. And this is the consequence. But it is also absolutely crucial to understand that we are now worried about global climate change causing insecurities for people around the world in different places for different reasons. But it's not environmental scarcity in the global south that is the cause of the security problem. It is very much the overconsumption of fossil fuels in the global north and in the other rapidly industrializing parts of the world more recently that is the cause of our insecurities in numerous different ways now. And getting that geography right, of course, is one of the fundamental things about rethinking the whole debate about environmental insecurity, which I've been hammering on about now for 45 minutes. Let me move on and say a few more things about this, because if we don't get it right, one of the other things that, of course, people are increasingly asking is there a technical fix to this? Can we put a sun shield up in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight and cool the earth? Can we do various other things through fertilization, planting more trees, using various things about like biochar and so on? Can we capture carbon dioxide? And well, in fact, we are doing many of these things inadvertently or sometimes quite directly by thinking about land use, thinking about reforestation, and various technological innovations. The one, of course, that causes all the fuss and the one that is worrisome is the increased reflectivity from aerosols pumped into the atmosphere, top right on my diagram here. Because, of course, what the idea there is you put whether it's sulfate compounds or calcium carbonate, basically ground up limestone. Can you spray it in very, very small particles into the upper atmosphere and use it as a shield? And of course, ironically too, next please, Stephanie, ironically too, attempts to calibrate some of the equipment to actually run the experiments on this has run into trouble precisely because the experimenters haven't asked indigenous peoples in both the south of the United States, Arizona, if I remember correctly, and also northern Sweden for permission to use their lands to actually do some of their initial calibration experiments. Because actually thinking seriously about, well, whose land is it, whose territory is it, who should consent is, of course, one of the crucial questions that we really do need to continue to address in Canada in terms of reconciliation, if that in fact is the most apt word, although it's the one that's been used. And I think that the irony of geoengineering experiments running into trouble precisely because they hadn't been consulting effectively with local indigenous peoples is something that once again connects us up with these discussions of land. And of course, the question then becomes, well, where do you do it? And the answer may well be you only take a boat out to sea and do it outside anybody's jurisdiction. And of course, there's worrisome concerns that this is exactly what may happen. Hence, the need to think about governing these kinds of things in some kind of global way intelligently. Can we mimic volcanoes following 1991's Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines? That's the sort of the big question. Next please, if we do, and then we suddenly stop, we end up with what is called a termination shock, where the world suddenly heats dramatically because the sunshade has been removed, and it's become the title of Neil Stephenson's recent novel. One of the other things that I think is really important to note is that in recent years, these big Anthropocene questions are being picked up by popular culture. The great derangement that Amitav Ghosh talked about a few years ago, wherein the cultural productions were simply ignoring these huge questions. That seems to be rapidly changing. And Neil Stephenson's attempt to sort of channel his inner Tom Clancy in a thriller novel, bits of it are fun, bits of it aren't great, but it really does raise the question of who does what where. And how it is that if one state decides they want to do engineering, or one large corporation decides they want to do geoengineering and one state decides they don't like it, how does that play out? Again, it's a geopolitics thing that would really be much better handled by some kind of global governance agreements in advance of the use of any of these geoengineering technologies in the upper atmosphere. And that is one of those issues that is simply essential now in terms of thinking about environmental security, but of course wasn't on the agenda back in 1972 when this debate really started. Next. A couple of years ago, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, put out this report on the geopolitics of energy transformation, adding one more twist to this discussion, which is important. Well, it's a few years old, I think. Next, please. The highlights really do still hold up in terms of the forces of change that are coming. The declining cost of solar energy and wind power is dramatic. We are getting clearly suffering from pollution and climate change. Governments and corporations are even beginning to set renewable energy targets, focusing on how to build this stuff. Technological innovation is coming rapidly. Batteries, storage, much more efficient uses of energy, the heat pump discussion, for instance. The divestment movement has been pushing hard to get investors to A, recognize the risks, B, to take a moral stance where we can't go on burning stuff to have a survivable future. Pension funds in particular have been pushed by people like yours truly, although I didn't have much success with my own university in terms of trying to get them to take this stuff seriously. And of course, public opinion, because whatever people may say, and people tend to underestimate how much their neighbors are concerned about it, if public opinion polls recently in North America are to be believed. And of course, that does matter politically. Next, please. Because clearly protest movements are also very much on our minds. I mean, the politics of this is extraordinary. If 10 years ago you told me that one of the crucial things that would have changed the climate discussion is that a pissed off teenager in Stockholm would have decided to take matters into her own hands, one would have been forgiven for being completely incredulous. But nonetheless, the cultural politics of this has been quite extraordinary. But it also adds one thing that I think is worth adding to our list of concerns, and that is that there's a profound generational politics to climate change. We think in geopolitics in terms of spaces and the rivalries of states and corporations, the struggle for power, the struggle for space, the struggle for resources. But we now have to think about both the dangers that come from climate change as a result of using too many of particular resources, i.e. fossil fuels. But we also need to think about this in generational terms too. In British Columbia, it's not accidental that the challenge to the incumbent supposed shoe-in leader for the New Democratic Party is substantially younger than most of the establishment in that party. The fact that she's female is also an issue, I think, but the generational politics of this, I think, is absolutely crucial. Because if you were born this century, let that thing sink in, if you were born this century, then clearly thinking about your pension in 2065 or 2070 is something that you might actually want to pay some attention to, because in a climate disrupted world, are you going to have one? Are there circumstances that will allow for a decent old age going to be available if we don't get a handle on fossil fuel consumption? Next, please. It is interesting that the 50-year anniversary Stockholm reflections on environmental security talks about a new era of risk. The whole language has shifted from 1972. We're now talking about security in global terms. We're now talking about increasing risks for all sorts of people, for different outcomes from climate change and other environmental disruptions, caused as a result of the extraordinary scale of the global economy, not the scarcities that were worrisome to many people in the 1970s. And it's that fundamental shift that is at the heart of this whole rethinking question. And I think that that's what we do need to focus on much more explicitly in the next 50 years of discussions about environmental change. The graphic on the cover does suggest North and South might be on different worlds. I'm not quite sure if the designers of the cover of their report really wanted to suggest that, but it does reflect I think, the realities of our changing world, it also actually neatly reflects back to Indira Gandhi's point in 1972 as well. Next, Stephanie. The politics plays in different ways too. I mentioned the Paris Agreement. My students upset about the fact that fossil fuels weren't even mentioned in 2015. But when one actually looks at the recent House investigation in Washington, it's quite clear that the business models for the big corporations that produce fossil fuels have nothing to do with their statements about net zero and pathways and all of that stuff. They have nothing to do with the business plans, and therein lies one of our major problems. How is it that political forces are going to be marshaled? How is it that market mechanisms are going to be used to undercut these business plans? Because quite clearly, if Shell and Exxon and all the rest of them continue the massive expansion, the massive extraction of fossil fuels, then the future is going to be indescribably hot for the Greta Thunbergs of this world. She knows it. And quite a lot of our colleagues who are on climate strikes on Fridays understand it too. The necessity of moving on this is becoming simply unavoidable. And the new politics of security are about tackling these business models fairly explicitly. Not only the corporations in the north, but in many cases also the national oil companies of many countries as well, that are relying on those kinds of revenues for their government funding of various things in the global south. That too needs to be addressed. We need a transition away from this kind of a business plan very quickly. Next, please, Stephanie. Which is, of course, what I am trying to grapple with the cover image on my Rethinking Environmental Security book. Is this the rising sun of solar power? Is it dispersing the fumes caused by the oil industry? Is this actually a colonizing soldier, or is it somebody surveying the scene using a strange surveying instrument? It looks like a pith helmet. Reminding us of the long-term historical consequences of long-term historical consequences of the expansion of European power. Is this likely to be war caused by oil yet again? And those causal relationships are very complicated indeed. All of these are issues that require us to grapple with the new agenda for environmental security, bearing in mind that it's fossil fuels, it's about firepower in both its senses, the military and the use of fire to power our societies, that we need to grapple with fairly directly if we're seriously thinking about environment and security for the future. Next, Andy. Maybe it is time to go solar. If we're using those military forces to remove native folks from their sacred land and build another oil pipeline. We know all about this in British Columbia, but although this was cast in the Dakotas with the Keystone fight some years ago. The point about this is that we really do need to stop thinking about further fossil fuels, building more pipelines. It's simply not the way to an environmentally secure future. Next. And those investment funds are beginning to move that direction. This is Bloomberg. The IEA reports will give you the same kind of numbers and trends recently, but this graph just works better as a PowerPoint slide. What matters is the yellow is solar, the blue is wind, and the amount of money going into adding electricity generation sector is now dramatically larger than coal and natural gas. And that trend, of course, is what is absolutely crucial if we are going to make a world that is less dependent on firepower in both its senses. And that is, of course, the crux of the issue, is moving this ahead much more quickly, phasing out the coal and the natural gas and oil for at least the electricity generation is moving ahead. And that's a good news story that we need to encourage in terms of thinking about security for the future. Just a few more slides. One more there, Stephanie, please. We need to build back better. Bicycle infrastructure is much needed in many places. I'm trying to find my way around Victoria on bicycles, and it's interesting that certainly the paths are there, but every now and again they run straight into old automobile-designed infrastructure, and you go, well, what the heck? Where's my path? Building new infrastructure to facilitate the use of technologies that don't depend on fossil fuels has to be a crucial part, not only of adaptation, but of actually building better future cities. Next, please, Steffi. But we also have another interesting development in that Vanuatu, another one of the Pacific Atoll states, just became the first nation state to call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. What's fascinating is that this is paralleling, once again, arms control initiatives. Don't build the stuff, ban certain kinds of weapons because they're too damn dangerous in the international system. That has been a long-standing part of the response to nuclear weapons, the response that the delegates in '72 in Stockholm demanded in that last part of the Stockholm Declaration. And we're seeing the same language, the same logic. These things are too dangerous. We have to stop building more fossil fuel infrastructure. And there's a headline suggesting that New Zealand will join that initiative from the headline from last week, suggesting New Zealand was on board for this. Again, a connection between security policy measures that actually mimic at least the language of the earlier concerns about nuclear weapons. Coming full circle back. Finally, we do need to think very seriously about the future. And for my money, this is a much better novel than Neil Stephenson's Termination Shock, because it explicitly tries to figure out how we get to that much better, more sustainable future. If you're thinking about Christmas presents, do give your friends, your colleagues, everybody this novel, because Kim Stanley Robinson is trying to think through how do we get to a better future. Just do warn them that they need to get over the first 25 pages, which are a bit rough. But once you get through that, this is an extraordinary novel in terms of trying to imagine how we get to that much better future. Because if we're serious about security, if we're serious about environment, if we're serious about coupling those two concepts together, we do need to think about a better future world. And we need to think about quite literally how we make it so that we both adapt to the unavoidable dangers, but also so we build a world that the Greta Thunbergs can happily retire in 2070. And I think it's that focus on getting to that better world that now has to be the crucial rethinking of environmental security. Fearing disruptions in the global south as a result of climate change is not the issue that we need to be focusing on. We need to be focusing on how to build a better world, how to move ahead, getting past fossil fuels, so that we have a solar and wind powered future that is livable for future generations. That's what environmental security now has to be about if it's to be meaningful contribution to public policy, to politics, and yes, to the increasingly prevalent popular culture discussions of these themes too, because it seems to me that this is where we do need to focus our scholarly efforts in coming years. And I think that's quite enough from me in terms of my formal presentation. Thank you for watching and listening. Apologies about the screw up with the computer plug-in thing a little earlier.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was great. And we have a few comments in the chat. As I have written in the chat at the beginning of the webinar, I'm asking you to signal in the chat that you're interested in raising a comment or a question. I think I'm going to give the floor to Rod Dobell, because during the talk he raised one question and had two comments as well. And I think it's a nice way to get started. So Rod, if you have the, if you want the floor, please take it.
Well, thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thank you, Simon. That's a superb summary, a wonderful overview, and I really think it's very timely to be picking up from Stockholm and onwards. I had all kinds of questions, but and I don't want to discourage things right from the start, but you're working with students all the time. There's been a certain amount of writing saying this is really challenging, but we have to have hope. On the other hand, there's also been some interest, and I'm wondering how you deal with this question with students. We have the folks at Oxford with the practical ethics argument, the long-termism argument that says, well, we may not be able to solve this thing for the next few generations, but there are thousands of generations to follow, and so really we don't have to worry so much about the fact that we're not making it very well with this. There will be some survivors, and those survivors will go on to be the parents of many future generations. So that's our long-term hope. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that response to the challenges that you outlined, but thank you again. It really was a great presentation.
Most of my students are more concerned about where they're going to get a job and how they might make a useful contribution over the next generation, not about the very long term. I mean, yes, the Oxford argument about the long term is important, but it does presuppose that we do actually solve these problems in the next few generations. Because, of course, the real nightmare that Orban and company are worried about is the fact that we don't solve it and we end up with particularly ocean acidification problems causing so much disruptions to life on Earth that humanity is extinct. It's the David Wallace Wells argument from his Uninhabitable Earth book a couple of years ago. And I think that gets the attention of my students, but they are really interested in how can they make a useful contribution? What skills, where do they get a job? How do they make a contribution to building that better world? And insofar as they're focused on that, I'll stick with that messaging and leave the long-term discussions, because you only have a long-term humanity if you solve at least enough of the problems in the short term to ensure that the planet is inhabitable for the long term. And that's the point that I make repeatedly to them, and it does seem to register.
Thanks. Thank you.
So we have a couple of comments in the chat, and so I think I'm going to invite Jamie Lawson to take the floor, and then Shukya will be after Jamie. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hadn't intended to speak because I'm sort of dressed for radio today, but thank you so much for your talk, which was very stimulating, and I've got a long list of reading to do. But my question was, in the name of thinking in terms of security, I mean, it is a literature and a tradition that is very much about strategic engagement with opposing forces. And while it's very important to try to emphasize and build a sense of we about these urgent issues, nonetheless, we have to contend with both political and military forces who are urgently and in many cases irrationally opposed to engaging with the whole subject. And certainly within this country, there is a very passionate subsector of the population that doesn't want to talk about this except to shut down the conversation. So I wonder if you had some thoughts here about the choice between winning hearts and minds, so to speak, and simply attempting to defeat and shut down the opposition to acting dramatically in these areas.
I guess that you need two answers to that. The first is specifically the military one, because that one cuts both ways, in fact. The military are usually the first agency called to deal with disasters. How was it, 500-600, can't remember, Canadian Armed Forces personnel heading into the Maritimes to help with disaster relief. A decade ago or so, there was a transition between from one commander of the Pacific commandant's command area in the U.S. Forces. And the famous line was, look, I don't know whether you're going to get into a conflict. What you are going to have to do for your next term as commander of these forces is deal with disasters. And you know, in terms of operational planning, you will be sideswiped if you haven't worked that into how you plan your command for the next few years. And clearly, the military get it also. I was on a webinar yesterday with Alice Hill, and she had that dramatic picture of what is it, Tyndall, the U.S. Air Force Base in Florida, the Hurricane Michael, I think it was 4 years ago, completely flattened and demolished a whole bunch of hangars, and they had something like 20 of their F-22s that were in for maintenance and couldn't be flown out of the way. So the you know, one of the major military bases in the U.S. had their top of the line fighter interceptor forces clobbered by a hurricane, and 6 months later the strategic bomber force was out of action for a substantial period of time because Offutt, strategic bomber base up in, can never remember, it's in the Dakotas, isn't it? Was literally the main runway was underwater. From extraordinary flooding. So the military is really aware of the fact that their own installations are highly vulnerable to the consequences of this, which means that in many cases they're actually taking this stuff seriously. Sorry, you wanted to come back?
I'm sorry, I may have misstated my question. I think I'm thinking less in terms of the military itself being on board, because I'd agree with you. National militaries do see these practical constraints, but I guess I'm thinking geopolitically. I'm thinking, if we don't think purely in military terms, about political constellations within countries and between countries that simply do not want to engage with this and actually would be more than happy to put environmentalists in jail for causing a threat to their comfortable life or their uncomfortable life, right? There are people who really are fighting this out of a sense that they have no other good jobs to go to.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is certainly there, and that's the political fight of our times, frankly. In terms of putting environmentalists in jail, yeah, well, I mean, that's what some of the climate protesters face in Britain at the moment. In other parts of the world, they're simply getting shot. The Guardian had a report a couple of weeks ago about, so far tracking these things, 1,700 environmentalists have been killed, mostly in the global south, for opposing development. There's no point in sugarcoating in this. I mean, this is the world that we live in. On the other hand, the vulnerabilities to climate change are growing, but also the vulnerabilities to fuel supply. I mean, this is the lesson surely out of the Ukraine and Europe in the last little while. We have a world in which those long supply lines of gas and oil are obviously vulnerable, and our security in terms of predictable supplies of energy, the so-called energy security issue, has been highlighted. The Russian forces invading Ukraine last February and March got into a huge amount of trouble because they didn't have fuel supply lines that were reliable. But ironically, the civilians in Europe are facing exactly the same problem. They don't have fuel supply lines that are reliable either. The problem isn't that they're dependent on Russian gas. The problem is that they're dependent on gas, period. And so, increasingly the recognition that this stuff coming from, well, who knows where in the international fossil fuel markets is actually rendering people vulnerable in all sorts of ways, is getting attention. And I mean, frankly, this is the political fight of our times. Good jobs, that's, of course, what the campaign for just transition is all about. And to Rob's question in a few minutes ago, I mean, part of the answer also is, well, don't train yourself as a petroleum engineer. Go find yourself a job in one of the emerging sectors. Give yourself some general engineering training or something or other, so that you can be flexible and you can do wind and solar, or you can do infrastructure provision for bike lanes or all the other new stuff we need. So think about jobs. But in terms of retraining, I mean, this is what unions are starting to jump up and down and say, look, we want to close down this stuff because it's wrecking the planet, but we want to make sure that the folks that are going to be displaced have somewhere to go to, that they can earn a living doing something useful. And that too is part of the whole adaptation, just transition discussion, because we have to think about this right through our societies. And unless we do that, we are not going to join up the proverbial dots. So all of those things need to be done. But let's not sugarcoat this. I mean, this is a big struggle. That point about the Shell corporation and the fact that they're saying to the public what what the public needs to hear about net zero, and net is usually a fudge because it's zero is what we need. But their business plan is doing other things. I mean, I think that has been a problem. 40 years ago, many of the big oil companies decided, climate change is a serious issue, but they figured that the threat to their business plan was what mattered rather than the threat to civilization. And that crucial choice made in many parts of the world is the legacy that we are now living with. And the politics of this is simply unavoidable because their business plans have to be changed, whether willingly or whether they are simply forced. How you mobilize the political forces to do that will, at least in part, be as a consequence of other modes of energy undercutting them in the market. And, every time we have a crisis, the gas prices spike, people fuss about their gas prices, unless, of course, they happen to be driving an electric vehicle. And therein, of course, lies another crucial part of the transition from one technology to another. Those of us who like to ride our electrically assisted bicycles, these old legs need a bit of assistance on the hills. But that's a technology that is a game changer in European cities and can be to a substantial extent in many other parts of the world. Yeah, it doesn't work so well in Ottawa in January, I get it, but in many other places, that this is a technology that allows you to live well without burning stuff, which has to be the key message going forward.
Thank you so much. Now we have a comment and a question from Shukya. Shukya, take the floor.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Dalby. I really liked it. And something that I really liked about it was I really liked how you centered in your idea of creating like a just, sustainable transition, talking about Indigenous territory and Indigenous governance in these situations. And so I was pretty caught off guard when you made a comment about if you were to want to conduct scientific experiments in Indigenous nations that know on their territory, how these things might have to happen on the sea. And so I kind of wanted to make a comment about that idea and how I think that we should start expanding and extending our conceptions of jurisdiction and really territorial practices to kind of beyond the land. As an example of like why this matters, and it's in the chat as well, but why it's important to consider is like locally we have, just for example, the Coast Salish Lumi tribe, and they're unable to access their traditional fishing areas because the Department of Homeland Security has said that it's too risky to go into that part of the ocean. So I wanted to kind of reframe it and see how we could think about oceans and seascapes and maritime life worlds as not necessarily inert space. And I think that also, particularly within conversations of borders, these areas are really important, right? Like they're in history of the transatlantic slave trade, and now we're having migratory deterrence happening, migratory regimes that are being stalled, and how the ocean is being utilized against migrants, how there's surveillance practices and border enforcement, and securitization happening on oceans. So anyways, I just kind of wanted to, I don't know that I necessarily have a question, but I just kind of wanted to make a small comment just about how we conceptualize the ocean in these much broader conversations of border regimes and environmental deterrence and all these things that go into them. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yes, a useful reminder of the terrestrocentrism of much of our thinking. Because we are territorial species or a land-based species, we tend to see the global system in those terms. I mean, that's one of the issues with the earth science literature, of course, is that the coupling of the ocean and the atmosphere is the crucial driving system for how the climate works out. despite the fact we're burning most of the fossil fuels on land. It's the ocean atmosphere intersection, and of course the hydrosphere with the melting ice sheets that is what's driving the changing climate. And we do need to understand that life was first and foremost an aqueous phenomena. And we're the terrestrial species are the Johnny-come-latelys in the history of the biosphere, and that perspective is a useful reminder when it comes down to homeland security, denying access to certain waters, and so on. We're back to these real jurisdictional questions, and this is why I'm always a little uneasy, particularly in British Columbia, about this thing called a land acknowledgement. Because there's a whole lot of other ecological things in the oceans and the air and so on that is the ecosystem context for the indigenous peoples before the people with my skin color showed up. And the point about this, I think, is that we need to understand ourselves as part of an Earth system. In my book, I go back to the old term ecosphere as a shorthand for this, because it seems to me that it's absolutely crucial. There's much more that could be said about oceans, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I downplay it in both my recent books. But you can't do everything and still get to the 80,000 words or 90,000 words that the publisher wants. And in terms of how the political game is engaged, it's on land much more than in the oceans. In the long run, the oceans are what it's all about. Particularly, of course, the worrisome thing is ocean acidification. If that plays out to such an extent that we cause major disruptions of ecosystems in the oceans, we're all in deep trouble. I'm not an oceanographer. I don't understand the finer points of ocean chemistry, so I tend to shy away from that, but don't underestimate its importance in this discussion.
We have suddenly one raised hand and a question in the chat. I'm going to give Jules, please raise your question really quickly so we can take Tatiana Chaban's question as well. Please, Jules.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I think you really gave us a really great sense of the emergency and the really need to quickly adapt. And I had a question because I feel like in the public discussion that alarming feeling have been translated in the expression eco-anxiety. And I was listening to a Marxist economist named Frédéric Lordon talking about the notion of eco-anxiety. And he argued that instead of being eco-anxious, we should be eco-angry, meaning that we should critically engage with the social structures that have produced the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, depending on how you want to present it. And so he suggested that we should, instead of trying to preserve what's the institution that we live in, that we question them and that we critically engage, for example, with border regimes and the police and military, as we discussed earlier, or with the system of property that is at the base of capitalism. So my question, I'm sorry, want to be an easy one, is how far do you think we should take adaptation, and is there a limit to it?
I mean, adaptation is simply unavoidable because of what's already, as they say, baked into the climate system. We simply have to work on adaptation. The trick, of course, is to do the adaptation in a way that simultaneously is mitigation, i.e. don't use ways to adapt that involve using more fossil fuels. That's the absolute crucial point. As to the eco-anxiety angle on this, look, working on this stuff isn't good for my mental health, frankly. Because one does end up reading all sorts of doom stuff, and one looks at some of the long-term trajectories and thinks, oh my God, we've had it. That was certainly my impression 10 years ago when they hired me in Laurier. And well, I mean, one of the reasons I deal with worrying about this thing is I work on it. I do talks, I write books, I teach, I do community discussion about this yesterday. And the way to deal with the anxiety is to get involved in something or other that is actively tackling the issue. Remember Yoda, fear is a real problem. You need to turn your energies into something productive. The Canadian Climate Institute report that I noted in my presentation points out that yes, we do need to do a whole bunch of adaptation because there's all sorts of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, but it ain't going to be enough. We have got to get those emissions down if the adaptations are ultimately going to work out. And the trick is both and, not either or. And that, I think, is now the circumstances we were in. Back in the 90s, everybody was focused on mitigation because that seemed to be the crucial thing. Well, it didn't work in terms of anything like adequate reductions in fossil fuels. So we're stuck with the adaptation agenda. But finding some way to do the mitigation, i.e. reducing the amount of fossil fuels simultaneously is absolutely essential. We cannot do one or the other. We have to do both. Getting them together so that we are doing them both simultaneously, of course, is the trick if you can manage it. In terms of activity, that depends on where you are institutionally, geographically. Find something useful to do. If possible, a career that allows you to make a positive contribution to, and that will help most with the eco-anxiety issue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jules and Simon, for your answer. We have one last comment from Tatiana Shaban. And Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. And my question is very quick and very possibly big, and it relates to the global governance issues. So I wanted you to maybe to clarify a bit more on the question of global governance and what mechanisms can be used to avoid territorial claims related to the issue of climate refugees from the states, and what actors in particular and on what level can be on the forefront of that fair relocation of the refugees or those in danger. So if you talk a bit more about it, that would be nice.
I mean, what's extraordinary watching Twitter, and I do spend too much time on Twitter, is Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is saying all the right things about this stuff. About climate, about conflict, about the necessity of looking after people that are in vulnerable situations. In terms of the current politics of this, I mean, the real problem most of us are facing is the rise of populism. And that goes back to the point that I was using Yoda to make. It's mobilizing fear. The Canadian situation, for all of the talk about excluding immigrants, the immigration numbers are fairly high recently. I haven't got the exact stats in my head. The problems that we have is that we are not thinking about ourselves as a mobile species. In many cases, having got to some place or other, we're saying, well, this is mine, even if actually squatting on it, as is the case for so many of us in terms of unceded territories. The bigger issue there is, how do you mobilize empathy? How do you mobilize compassion? How do you understand immigrants as potentially useful employees or potentially friendly neighbors? How do you understand that they might actually bring some really interesting cultural ideas or a good recipe book with them, enriching our lives? And I think that shifting the conversation from fear to opportunity is tricky in present circumstances, particularly because fear is so easy to mobilize in political discourse, as the populists of our time have discovered. That remains the challenge. In terms of global governance, our problem remains the question of the fact that most governance is still done by states. Much of global governance over the last 50, 60 years through United Nations and the massive treaty systems are an attempt to, file off the rough edges, the consequences of the worst attributes of state sovereignty. And that still is a work in progress. But ultimately, politicians have to be pushed, and the arguing back against the fearfulness of the populists is a task for all of us. And how you do that again comes back to the point, well, which community are you involved in? Where do you have access to which political system? If people are being denigrated and dehumanized, call the speakers on that and say, wait a minute, this is a human being. This is somebody that needs somewhere to live. They're not a threat to us. They're actually somebody that needs our compassion. And back to the question of the long-term ethics, the short-term ethics are welcoming the stranger rather than seeing them as a threat. And the practical cultural politics of that runs right through our lives. There's no one answer to that point. In terms of global governance, advocating international cooperation wherever you can has to be part and parcel of it. And in terms of institution building, Canada's better than perhaps many in terms of doing this. We unfortunately undercut our credibility on the climate change thing because of our addiction to oil industry and fossil fuels. So that one's tricky in terms of our role in climate change. Find your angle, whether it's the local media, whether it's your local church, whether it's community groups, whether it's on campus, and a larger cultural understanding of our common fate, working out differently in different circumstances, but our common fate has to be part of our dialogue wherever we are. And I don't know you and your circumstances. I can't make any more specific suggestions than that. But clearly, the global governance issue remains a major issue, which the war in Ukraine is really making matters worse rather than better at the moment. And we just have to struggle through that. Eventually, that war will come to an end, and hopefully, better times internationally will follow. But hope isn't a strategy. You have to get out there and do something because it's the right thing to do, and it may make a difference.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simon. So please join me all in thanking Simon Dalby for this wonderful talk and engaging discussion afterwards. I want to add that the webinars will be held 4 times a year. We are planning them for a period that will last probably 5 or 6 years, and we'll try to have the dates and the speakers well ahead of time so you can put them in your calendar and follow the webinars. Also, remember that they are always available on our YouTube channels. So follow the Big Labs activities and you'll see that. Simon, thank you so very much for this. It's wonderful. And I'm delighted to have had you, and to have you with us for the next few months. It's so much to think about. So